Before we dive in, if Cold War aviation stories are your thing, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You're watching Vintage Aviation, and today's story is one of those moments in history that should never have gotten as close as it did. Picture this. It's the early hours of the morning. The ocean is black. The air is silent. Somewhere inside a Soviet air defense sector, a radar operator is staring at a glowing screen, watching the sky the way you'd watch a locked door in a bad neighborhood. Because during the Cold War, the nightmare wasn't just that war could happen. It was that it could happen by surprise. Then a blip appears where it shouldn't. No clean flight plan, no friendly identification, no reassuring transponder telling you, relax, it's civilian. Just a track, moving, quiet, wrong. And here's what most people don't fully grasp. In that era, an unknown aircraft wasn't merely lost. It could be a probe, a spy mission, a deliberate test of your response, or the opening move of something that ends cities. The entire logic of Cold War air defense was built around one brutal truth. You will not get perfect information, and you will not get much time. Because speed wasn't just performance back then. Speed was policy. This is the story of the Cold War jet that nearly helped push the world over the edge. Not because it carried a nuclear weapon, but because it was built to answer one question. Fast. Who are you? And what are you doing in my airspace? That jet was the Sukhoi Su-15, NATO codename Flagon. It isn't the aircraft most people name first when they think about Cold War legends. It doesn't have the celebrity of a MiG-21 or the myth of an SR-71. But it didn't need fame. It was a blade, kept sharp for one moment and launched when someone believed the border had been crossed. And on the night that matters in this story, a flight drifted, whether by error, miscalculation, or something darker, into Soviet airspace. And the Su-15 was sent to meet it. So let me plant a question right now that I want you to carry through the whole video, because it's the heart of this entire controversy. Was what happened next an interceptor doing its job, or was it a tragic misread that could have lit the fuse for World War III? Go to the comments and write one word, defense or tragedy, and as we go, see if your answer changes. Now, to understand why this got so dangerous, you have to feel the pace of it. Events like this don't unfold like a documentary with calm narration and a neat timeline. They unfold like a countdown. A radar contact is detected. Someone tries to classify it. Communications don't line up. The track keeps moving. The uncertainty grows. And with every minute that passes, the scenario becomes more threatening. Not necessarily because the aircraft is doing something aggressive, but because no one can prove it isn't. In the Cold War, being wrong in the relax, it's fine direction was unthinkable. If you assume friendly and you're wrong, your country pays the price. But being wrong in the shoot direction creates a different kind of disaster, one that can spill into politics, retaliation, and escalation before anyone can breathe. That's how you get a world where a single radar blip can become a crisis. Somewhere out on a runway, ground crews sprint into motion. A pilot straps into a cockpit designed around one mission: get airborne quickly, climb hard, be guided by controllers, reach the target before it reaches anything important, and end the question. The Su-15 wasn't built for show. It wasn't built to circle and negotiate. It was a high-speed interceptor shaped by the fear that something could come over the horizon with no warning. Its job was to be the fast, hard response. Close the distance, identify the intruder, and if ordered, stop it. And that last part is where everything becomes chilling, because when an interceptor is launched, it doesn't take off assuming everyone will go home. It takes off under the shadow of a possibility. If this contact is part of a broader strike, if it's bait or distraction or the first piece of a bigger move, then this flight might be the pilot's last. That's the mindset inside those systems. That's the atmosphere behind those decisions. Not calm, not patient, not forgiving. And it raises the question that makes this story so uncomfortable. What do you do when you're climbing into the dark with incomplete information, and the voice in your headset says the target is inside your border, not responding and heading deeper? Do you treat it like an accident, or like the first step of an attack? We're going to peel back why the Su-15 existed in the first place, what it was designed to stop, why Soviet air defense doctrine was so aggressive, and how the pressure of that doctrine could turn a confusing situation into a point of no return. But before we go there, answer this in the comments. If you were in that cockpit and you didn't have all the facts, Would you fire if ordered? Or would you refuse and risk being wrong? And what would you do if refusing meant you might be blamed for whatever happened next? To understand how a single interception could spiral into a world-level crisis, you have to understand what the Su-15 really was, and more importantly, what kind of world built it. In the West, people often picture Cold War fighters as dogfighting machines, sleek jets chasing each other in a blue sky. But the Soviet Union invested heavily in something different, an air defense empire, a vast shield built around the assumption that the next war would begin with bombers appearing over the horizon, fast, high, and possibly carrying weapons that didn't give you a second chance. That shield had a name, the PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces. And the PVO didn't think like a typical air force. Its mindset wasn't win air superiority. Its mindset was stop the raid. It was a nationwide system of early warning radars, command posts, guided interception, and fighter regiments that existed for one job: detect an intruder, track it, and kill it before it reaches something vital. If you grew up inside that system, you didn't see an unknown aircraft as a curiosity. You saw it as a potential countdown. Now, imagine what that does to decision-making. Imagine how it rewires the human brain. If your job is to prevent surprise attack, then every unknown contact is a test, and every hesitation is a vulnerability. That is the psychological pressure that sits behind the Su-15. The Flagon was built for speed and climb because those were the currencies of interception. The threat wasn't just a fighter slipping across the border. The nightmare was a high-flying intruder, reconnaissance aircraft mapping defenses, or bombers probing routes, or anything that could reach deep targets before anyone could respond. And the Soviet Union had real reasons to fear that kind of intrusion. Across the Cold War, both sides ran reconnaissance missions that felt, to the other side, like a finger hovering over a trigger. Sometimes those missions were deliberate, sometimes they were ambiguous on purpose, because ambiguity itself gathered intelligence. You learned how quickly the other side reacted, which radars lit up, which units scrambled, what altitudes were covered, what gaps existed. So when the PVO saw a suspicious track, it wasn't simply a blip. It was a question. Is this a mistake, a test, or a prelude? That's why aircraft like the Su-15 weren't designed around pilot independence and free hunting. They were designed to be part of a machine. The Interceptor would launch quickly, climb aggressively, and then be guided by controllers who could see the wider picture. The pilot wasn't just flying an airplane, he was executing a solution to a radar problem. And that leads to one of the most important, unsettling details in this story. In many intercept scenarios, the pilot didn't choose the geometry. He followed instructions, he followed vectors, he followed commands. Because the entire philosophy was that ground control could coordinate faster than one pilot's eyes and instincts. It's efficient, it's effective, and in the wrong situation, it can become terrifying, because it compresses complex, human, messy reality into a simple binary. Comply or don't, engage or don't, fire or don't. The Su-15 itself reflected that philosophy. It was not built to dance, it was built to arrive. It carried weapons designed to end intrusions quickly, and it operated inside a doctrine that valued certainty, even if that certainty had to be manufactured under pressure. Now layer on the most volatile ingredient of all, politics. In a world where leaders believed they might be attacked without warning, every airspace violation carried symbolic weight. Borders weren't just lines on maps, they were declarations of strength. And in the Soviet view, allowing repeated intrusions could be interpreted as weakness, an invitation for more tests, more probes, and eventually something worse. So the PVO lived under a brutal contradiction. If you react too softly, you appear vulnerable. If you react too harshly, you risk creating the very escalation you're trying to prevent. This is where the Su-15 becomes more than an aircraft. It becomes a policy tool with wings. And that's why the night we're building toward is so dangerous. Because when an unknown aircraft crosses into that world, it doesn't just meet a pilot and a jet. It meets a system that has rehearsed this moment thousands of times, a system trained to treat ambiguity as threat, and a system that has been taught that hesitation is how countries die. Here on Vintage Aviation, I want you to feel that pressure, because it changes the moral math. From far away, with hindsight, it's easy to say, just identify the aircraft. But in real time, at night, with confusing tracks, imperfect communication, and a Cold War mindset that assumes deception is normal, identification can become a trap. You get close, you try to signal, you try to interpret. While the clock keeps ticking, and higher command demands an answer. And here's the chilling part. In that environment, the Su-15 pilot might not even be the primary decision maker. The pilot is the final link in a chain of fear, doctrine, and orders. The pilot's hands may be the ones that act, but the momentum is coming from somewhere deeper. So when people ask, how could this happen? Part of the answer is that it didn't happen because one person was reckless. It happened because the system was designed to make one outcome more likely than all the others. Interception that ends decisively. Now we're ready to step into the night itself, because the unknown aircraft doesn't just appear and vanish. It moves, it continues, it forces the chain of command to tighten, it creates urgency, and the Su-15, doing exactly what it was built to do, closes the distance. We're going to get specific about the incursion. What kind of aircraft it was, why it ended up where it did, what warnings were attempted, and the moment where seconds mattered and interpretations became fate. Before we go there, I want you to answer one question in the comments, because it's the moral hinge of the entire story. Do you think an interceptor like the Su-15 is more dangerous because it's fast and heavily armed, or more dangerous because it's part of a system that can turn uncertainty into a shoot decision? The night that brought the Su-15 into history began like thousands of other nights in commercial aviation. A passenger jet climbing into the dark, cabin lights dimmed, people settling in, expecting nothing more dramatic than a bumpy stretch of air and a tired landing. The aircraft was a wide-body airliner on a long international route across the North Pacific, one of those flights where most of the work is invisible. Navigation checks, waypoints, oceanic procedures, a steady hum of engines and routine. But somewhere along that quiet, the flight began to drift. Not a sharp turn, not a dramatic dive, just a gradual deviation, one that, over time, placed it on a track it was never supposed to be on. Over the ocean, small errors can stay hidden for longer than anyone likes to admit. There are no city lights beneath you to confirm position, no highways, no mountains you recognize, just black water and instruments that you trust, until you shouldn't. And the problem with drifting over the North Pacific in the Cold War is that the Pacific wasn't just empty space, it was a chessboard. It bordered some of the most sensitive military territory on Earth, places where radar stations didn't look at the sky the way airports do. They looked at it the way a sentry looks at a perimeter fence. So when that track began to approach Soviet airspace, the experience on the ground was nothing like a civilian flight might be off course. To the PVO, it looked like exactly the kind of mystery they'd been trained to fear. A large aircraft on an unusual path near strategic sites, behaving in a way that didn't match expectations. And in the Cold War, expectations were everything. Think about the mental collision that happens here. In the cockpit, you have routine. In the cabin, you have routine. But on the other side of the border, you have alarms, calls, and that tightening sensation in the chest that says, this could be a test, or worse. Controllers begin building a picture. Radars hand tracks from station to station. The unknown aircraft is not just a dot, it's a moving question. And the longer the question moves without an answer, the heavier it becomes. Fighters are scrambled. This is where the Su-15 enters like a shadow at the edge of a spotlight. The Flagon was built to climb fast and reach targets that would otherwise pass through defended airspace before anyone could act. It didn't need to be elegant. It needed to be there. Now picture the Interceptor pilot's world for a second. There's no passenger cabin, no context, no faces. There is only a voice on the radio, a vector, a target, and the weight of what your country expects you to do. You don't get to assume lost airliner. You assume unknown. And that is a completely different category. The Interceptor climbs into the same night the airliner is flying through, yet they are not living in the same reality at all. One is a line on a schedule. The other is an intruder in a tense, militarized sky. As the distance closes, everything becomes about identification. The Cold War had procedures for this, but procedures are fragile when the sky is dark, speeds are high, and the target doesn't respond the way you expect. Visual identification at night is difficult. Radio communication can be mismatched. Frequencies don't line up, language barriers exist, and the moment you add uncertainty, you add danger. The Interceptor approaches, trying to get close enough to understand what he's looking at. At night, a large airliner can look strange. Lights, silhouettes, reflections, and the sheer scale of the thing. But from a defensive mindset, even a large aircraft can be a threat. Large aircraft can carry cameras, sensors, jammers, or worse. And in that era, both sides had flown large reconnaissance aircraft and special mission platforms that blurred the line between civil and military in the eyes of an anxious defender. So the Su-15 pilot tries to do what interceptors are supposed to do: get close, signal, force compliance. But here's the nightmare detail: compliance is not a switch you flip. It's a negotiation carried out at hundreds of knots, in darkness, with lives and politics hanging off every second. Somewhere in this chain, warnings are attempted, maneuvers are made, signals that might be obvious in daylight become ambiguous at night. And meanwhile, up the command chain, patience erodes. Because the aircraft is still inside sovereign airspace. It is still not behaving correctly. And the doctrine isn't built for long philosophical debates. This is the moment where history starts to narrow. Because once you have fighters in the air, and the target continues, and nobody can get a clean resolution, the options begin shrinking. What starts as identify becomes force down. What starts as force down becomes stop it. And in a Cold War system, stop it is a simple word that can carry catastrophic consequences. Now, at this point in the story, people often ask the most human question of all: how could anyone mistake an airliner for something else? The answer is uncomfortable. Sometimes they don't mistake it in a clean way. Sometimes they simply don't know, and the system they operate inside treats "I don't know" as unacceptable. This is where the Su-15 becomes less like an aircraft and more like a fuse. Because if the order comes down to engage, if a missile is launched at a target that later turns out to be civilian, then the incident doesn't stay in the sky. It falls into politics, headlines, accusations, retaliation, and military readiness on both sides. It becomes the kind of crisis that forces leaders to choose between backing down and doubling down. And that's why people later said it nearly started World War III. Not because everyone wanted war, but because the momentum of outrage and fear can move faster than diplomacy. What the Interceptor pilot likely perceived, what command likely believed, how close the world came to immediate escalation, and the moment when a single action turned a border incident into an international shockwave. But before we cross that line together, answer this in the comments. If you were a Soviet commander that night, watching an unidentified large aircraft penetrate deep into sensitive airspace with no clear response, would you assume it was a civilian navigation error or a deliberate intelligence mission hiding behind a civilian profile? Tell me which one you believe and what detail would convince you. By the time the Su-15 finally caught up, the situation had stopped feeling like a simple border mistake. On Soviet radar scopes, it was an unidentified track that had wandered into one of the most sensitive slices of airspace on Earth, and every minute it remained there made commanders more certain it was deliberate. The target was Korean Airlines Flight 007, a Boeing 747 filled with passengers who believed they were crossing the Pacific on a routine overnight leg. In the cockpit, the crew followed what they thought was the proper oceanic route, unaware that a slow drift in navigation had carried them far off their intended corridor. To the PVO, context mattered more than labels. This wasn't empty sky. It bordered bases, radars, and strategic facilities the Soviet Union feared could be targeted in a first strike. An aircraft that penetrated that space without clear identification looked less like an accident and more like a probe, especially in an era when both sides ran intelligence missions designed to measure response times and expose defenses. Interceptors were scrambled, and the Su-15, fast, high-climbing, and built to be guided from the ground, was vectored toward the intruder with an urgency that left little room for doubt. As the flag enclosed the distance in the dark, the pilot's world narrowed to vectors, altitude calls, and a growing silhouette ahead. Night interception is messy, lights can mislead, distances compress quickly, and radio contact is never guaranteed when two aircraft are on different frequencies and speaking different languages. Procedures existed for warning and escorting an intruder, but they depended on being understood, and on the intruder behaving in a way that matched expectations. From the Interceptor's perspective, the big jet kept flying on, steady and silent, deeper into prohibited airspace. Up the chain of command, patience thinned into pressure. In a system trained to treat uncertainty as danger, "we don't know" was not an acceptable endpoint. Orders sharpened from identify, to compel, to stop. The Su-15 carried missiles built for exactly that last verb, and once the engagement decision moved from a possibility to an instruction, the pilot's role became the final link in a chain already set in motion. Moments later, missiles left the rails and raced toward the 747, turning a navigational error into a catastrophe that would be felt worldwide. Inside the airliner, there was no warning that geopolitics had just entered the cabin. The crew faced alarms and confusion, the aircraft began to lose control, and the descent that followed ended with the loss of all 269 lives on board. Then, the shockwave hit the ground. Washington condemned the shootdown as an outrage. Moscow framed the intrusion as a provocation and insisted its defenses had been challenged. With trust already brittle, each statement hardened the other side's suspicion, and what might have been a contained incident threatened to become a test of resolve between nuclear powers. That is why this story still feels like a fuse, not because anyone wanted a world war, but because outrage can move faster than facts, and militaries can posture faster than diplomats can breathe. For vintage aviation, the chilling lesson is that the Su-15 did what it was built to do, and the tragedy came from the collision of a human mistake with a system that could not afford to assume innocence. When you strip away slogans, you're left with the hardest question of the Cold War. How do you defend a border without letting fear decide what a target is? That changed everything forever. In your view, what was the decisive moment that night? The moment the 747 disappeared from the sky, the incident stopped being an interception and became a global emergency of perception. News raced across time zones faster than any official statement could keep up. Families woke to phone calls that didn't make sense. Airports turned into waiting rooms full of silence. Governments moved into crisis mode, not only to understand what happened, but to control what the world would believe happened. Because in the Cold War, belief could be as dangerous as fact. In Washington, the shootdown was framed as a moral outrage, a civilian airliner destroyed in cold blood. In Moscow, it was framed as a defensive response to an unidentified aircraft penetrating sovereign airspace in a region tied to strategic security. Two narratives collided immediately, and neither side could afford to look weak in front of its own people or the other superpower. That's the part that made the world feel unsteady. Both sides were talking as if the other side was capable of the worst, and both sides had enough weapons to make those fears catastrophic. Public condemnation rose quickly, and behind the speeches, there was a harder pressure. What do you do next without escalating? If the United States responded too softly, it could look like acceptance of civilian deaths. If the Soviet Union admitted too much too early, it could look like loss of control, or guilt, or vulnerability. This is how an aviation tragedy becomes a strategic trap. When national pride and deterrence are involved, leaders can feel forced to harden their posture, even while they privately fear what hard posture might trigger. In that atmosphere, every military movement, every radar activation, every headline could be misread as preparation for something bigger. At the United Nations, the argument unfolded like a courtroom where the jury was the entire planet. Demands for proof ran into the realities of secrecy, intelligence, and politics. There were calls for recordings, for timelines, for radar data, for a clear explanation of warnings and decisions. The absence of immediate transparency only deepened suspicion, and suspicion is fuel that burns hot in a world already trained to expect deception. Over time, more information emerged through investigation and later releases, and the picture that formed was not comforting. It suggested that you didn't need a grand conspiracy to get to disaster. You needed a navigation drift that went unnoticed long enough to matter, communication that didn't connect cleanly across languages and frequencies, and a defense doctrine that treated ambiguity as danger. The tragedy was not just that someone made a mistake, but that the system on the other side was designed to respond decisively before certainty was possible. Then the world asked a different question, one that reached far beyond blame. How do we keep this from happening again? Aviation is built on routines, but safety is built on what changes after routines fail. The shootdown added urgency to better route monitoring, tighter navigation discipline, and stronger international focus on keeping civilian aircraft from wandering into the deadliest airspace on Earth. It also pushed political momentum toward making advanced navigation more widely available to civilians, so that getting lost in an age of jets became less likely. Today, it's hard to imagine global travel without satellite navigation as a normal, everyday tool. But part of the reason the world moved toward that future was the shock of realizing how thin the margin for error really was. And that's why the title still fits. The Cold War jet that nearly started World War III isn't about a single aircraft being uniquely evil. It's about a world where fear had been engineered into systems, where doctrine rewarded speed over doubt, and where a civilian mistake could be interpreted through the lens of strategic survival. The Su-15 became the sharp end of that mindset, and when the missile trails faded, What remained was a scar on international trust and a warning written in human lives. So here's what I want you to write in the comments to lock your position in. Start with nearly World War III and finish the sentence with what you think truly caused it. Navigation, communication, doctrine, or politics. Which one do you believe mattered most, and why? Years after the shootdown, what makes this story unsettling is not that it belongs to some distant, irrational past, but that it shows how modern systems behave when they're forced to decide faster than they can truly know. The Cold War ended, the Soviet Union fell, and the Su-15 faded into museums and retirement lists. Yet the ingredients that created that night never fully disappeared. Imperfect navigation, imperfect communication, and human beings interpreting ambiguous information under pressure. For airliners, the legacy was immediate and practical. Regulators and airlines doubled down on route discipline, cross-checks, and the expectation that crews continuously confirm they are actually on the track they believe they're on, especially over oceanic stretches where a small error can hide for hours. Governments also accelerated the idea that precise satellite navigation shouldn't be a privileged military advantage forever. The logic was simple. If civilian pilots always know exactly where they are, the odds of wandering into a lethal misunderstanding drop dramatically. Technology can't remove risk, but it can shrink the space where maybe turns into shoot. For militaries, the lesson was more uncomfortable. Interception doctrine is built on deterrence, and deterrence is built on the promise that borders matter. But the Cal 007 crisis showed how quickly a defensive posture can become a headline that isolates you, hardens the other side, and invites escalation. It forced a question that every air defense system still wrestles with. How do you protect sovereignty without letting uncertainty automatically become guilt? Warning shots, escort procedures, visual identification, communication standards, and rules of engagement all exist for a reason. But they only work when the target understands what is happening and has the ability to comply. And that brings us back to the jet in the title. The Su-15 was fast, capable, and ruthless in the way it was meant to be. It wasn't designed to be famous, and it wasn't designed to be gentle. It was designed to arrive before the intruder could reach anything important. In the Cold War, that design philosophy made sense to the people who lived with the fear of surprise attack. The tragedy is that a machine built to stop bombers ended up stopping a passenger flight, and the world was reminded that fear can turn the sky into a courtroom with no appeals. Here on Vintage Aviation, I don't want this to end as a simple verdict, because the honest truth is that history is messy. A navigation error can be real, and a defensive system can still be dangerous. A commander can believe he's preventing a disaster while creating one. That tension is exactly why this incident still hits so hard. It's not a story about villains and heroes as much as it is a story about momentum, doctrine, and the cost of being wrong. So, I want you to lock in your takeaway with a comment. Write, the jet that nearly started World War III, and then finish the sentence with what you think mattered most. Navigation, communication, doctrine, or politics. And if you think it's a mix, tell me which link in the chain you would change first. Thanks for watching Vintage Aviation. If you want more Cold War aviation stories told like a thriller, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history at Mach speed. Your support keeps these deep dives coming and helps viewers discover the channel when the story matters most. Now, one last question. If you were writing the rules for intercepting an unknown aircraft today, what single rule would you add to prevent another Cal 07, and why?